The dialectic of merging Christianity and Marxism. The dialectic of merging Christianity and Marxism. Here is a picture of a report put out in 1946 by UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization. Its purpose and its philosophy by Julian Huxley, its first director. His brother would have been Aldous Huxley. And here's what he declared in the report, Julian Huxley. The task is to help the emergence of a single world culture. At the moment, two opposing philosophies of life confront each other. You may categorize the two philosophies as supernationalism or as individualism versus collectivism. Now I want you to pay attention, because here we're going to now start seeing the thesis and the antithesis, the idea and the opposite idea. And here comes the Hegelian dialectic process of George Hegel, followed by Karl Marx, one of the four men revered by the Frankfurt School, that says you must set up conflict. Or as Saul the Red Alinsky, as you heard tonight, dedicated his book in the original publication, Rules for Radicals, to Satan, the first rebel who at least won his own kingdom, it said in the dedication. Saul Alinsky said the change comes from the conflict. The change comes from the conflict. That's George Hegel. You deliberately set up conflict because the change comes from the conflict. Why? Because people get tired of the conflict and they're willing to compromise to have peace and unity and consensus and stop the fighting, to get along. And so there is this conflict that comes, and you must give in if you want to go along to get along. Or if you don't want to be attacked, or you don't want your name dragged through the mud with lie after lie on social media, you give up, you give in. And so notice that Julian Huxley, the first director of the UNESCO, says that there must be this conflict. You may categorize the two philosophies as supernationalism, or as individualism versus collectivism, or as capitalism versus communism, or as Christianity versus Marxism. Can these opposites be reconciled? This antithesis be resolved in a higher synthesis? I believe not only that this can happen, but through the exhortable dialectic of evolution, it must happen. What's he saying? We want the conflict so we can then get socialism and capitalism to merge. Today, they call that Fabian socialism or communitarianism, promoted by some of the biggest names in evangelicalism, like Rick Warren, Bob Buford, who just passed away last week, Bill Hybels, who now I guess is no longer at his church due to problems, Rick Warren, Tim Keller. These guys are all now mixing socialism with capitalism, also known as communitarianism, or what they call the third way or the three-legged stool. But how do you get there? You pit opposites against each other till people say, I'll give up just so we can all get along. I'm tired of the conflict. Or I give up because I'm tired of being called names. I'm tired of having my reputation run through the mud. I'll give up. I'll join the consensus. Well, I'm not joining the consensus. In fact, there was an organization called Third Way, and they wrote a report a few years ago called Come Let Us Reason Together, a fresh look at shared cultural values between evangelicals and progressives. Progressives, that's another word for socialist. Let's find a way for evangelical conservatives and socialists to get together. Thesis and antithesis, idea, opposite idea. Free market, conservative, evangelical, capitalist, constitutionalist, and social justice, socially, politically liberal, emergent church, neo-Calvinist, cultural Marxist, progressives. How can these opposites be reconciled? Through a friction, a tension, and a third way. And of course, it ended up being endorsed by Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, Richard Mowell, Fuller Theological Seminary, and many others, including Jim Wallace of Sojourners, who's pretty much been behind pretty much every communist revolution in South America over the last 40 years. In a book that came out in 2009 called Deep Church, A Third Way Between Emerging and Traditional, Jim Belcher writes, yet the two sides can't get along, talking about the evangelicals and the emergent church. The emergent church started in the late 90s, mid-90s, and it was people who denied essential Christian doctrines. They were very liberal theologically, denying essential Christian doctrines, the inerrancy of Scripture, salvation by Christ alone, the exclusivity of Christ. They also tended to be very pro-abortion, very much in favor of socialism. And this was the emergent church. Rob Bell is perhaps one of the most well-known emergent church leaders, Brian McLaren. And this Jim Belcher wrote a book in 2009 and said, is there a way for evangelicals in the emergent church to come together? For a third way? The Hegelian dialectic? He said, yet the two sides can't get along. They're both hostile to each other, using their writings and conferences to denounce the other side. The vast majority of people are confused by the debate. Many have read emerging authors agreeing with their assessment of the problem and aspects of what they are proposing, but they also have read traditional authors and are, well, drawn to parts of their vision of the church as well. The majority want to learn from both sides. This book is written for those caught in the middle. They are unhappy with the present state of the evangelical church, but are not sure where to turn for an answer. They like some of what the emerging and traditional camps offer, but they are not completely at ease with either. The public conflicts make this anxiety worse, and these people don't know who to trust or believe. What if both are off target? Is there a third option? Via media? I believe there is a third way. I will demonstrate the strength and weaknesses of both groups and move beyond them to a third way, the deep church. We're going to merge evangelicals, emergent, mysticism, social justice, ecumenicalism, universalism with traditional evangelical Christianity. There's nothing more than the demonic girl speaking forth biblical truth to gain a little credibility, get their foot in the door, and then undermine the gospel. And yet, who's endorsed this? The book was endorsed by none other than the founder of the Gospel Coalition, Tim Keller. He said, Jim Belcher shows that we don't have to choose between orthodox evangelical doctrine on the one hand and cultural engagement, creativity, and commitment to social justice on the other. This is an important book. In other words, we don't have to choose between traditional orthodox Christianity and the social justice of socialism. We can merge them for a third option. Tim Keller, founder of the Gospel Coalition, which is influencing tens of thousands of pastors and hundreds of thousands of church leaders and young people. And yet, Tim Keller, the founder of the Gospel Coalition, as you've already heard, is one of the leading church planters of these new type of churches promoting cultural Marxism, working in conjunction with people like Matt Chandler of Acts 29, David Platt, and Mark Dever. They all run together on the Gospel Coalition. And I'll conclude with this tonight. We'll pick it up tomorrow night right here. Here's a book by Timothy Keller, The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism. In this book, he says this: the history and philosophy departments on the college campuses when he grew up were socially radicalized and were heavily influenced by the neo-Marxist critical theory of the Frankfurt School. In 1968, this was heady stuff. The social activism was particularly attractive, and the critique of American bourgeois society was compelling, but its philosophical underpinnings were confusing to me. I seem to see two camps before me, and there was something radically wrong with both of them. The people most passionate about social justice were moral relativists, while the morally upright didn't seem to care about the oppression going on all over the world. I was emotionally drawn to the former path. What young person wouldn't be? Liberate the oppressed and sleep with who you wanted. But I kept asking the question, if morality is relative, why isn't social justice as well? This seemed to be a blatant inconsistency in my professors and their followers. Yet now I saw the stark contradiction in the traditional churches. How could I turn back to the kind of orthodox Christianity that supported segregation in the South and apartheid in South Africa? Christianity began to seem very unreal to me, though I was unable to discern a viable alternative way of life and thought. So what is he doing here? He likes what the cultural Marxists had to offer. He was influenced by the Frankfurt School. He didn't like their moral relativism, but he couldn't go back to Orthodox Christianity. So what did he do? He merged the two, and that's why you see him endorsing the book, Third Way. And that's why you see in his book, Generous Justice, which should really be called Social Justice, that he goes on to quote Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who is the father of liberation theology that is mixing Christianity with Marxism. But does he tell you that? No, he calls him theologian. He doesn't bother to tell his audience who he's quoting in the book. He doesn't say, by the way, I'm quoting a man who promoted liberation theology, which is the mixture of Marxism with Christianity. He just calls him a theologian. And yet, some of the biggest names in evangelicalism speak for, work with, and share the platform with these folks at the Cultural Marxist Gospel Coalition. Does that mean everybody associated with the Gospel Coalition believes in cultural Marxism? No. Some of them just don't know and don't get it. And let me tell you something. We have had, and you can ask Shahram Hadian this, Shahram has had pastors come to him and say, hey, by the way, we're watching what's going over there at WVW Broadcast Network and what Brannon's saying and doing on radio and TV, and as a result of what your buddy's doing over there, we have just gotten our church out of the Gospel Coalition. And if you doubt that, ask Shahram Hadian, and he'll tell you the story himself. So in conclusion tonight, we'll pick up tomorrow. There is a dialectic going on. A deception, a dialectical deception, truth and error, fighting. And many people will give up because they will say, I don't want the conflict. I want to get along. I don't want to be branded Islamophobic. I don't want to be branded as having a bad attitude. I don't want to be branded as being against everything. I just want to go along. I want peace. I want unity. I yearn to be a part of the group. Well, my friends, if you're going to be a part of the group, you will compromise truth if that is what is the entry into the group. If that is what's important to you, the group over the truth, you will compromise truth. But I contend most of you here tonight are more interested in truth than being a part of the group. There is a great war going on within the church. But how many of your Christian friends, pastors, and elders know what we've been talking about tonight? That's why it's so important that you're here and you take it back to them. You help them to understand Satan's ploy of a dialectical deception. We'll continue this tomorrow night. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you.